So for the rest of class today, we're going to talk about referencing. So we highlighted last week when we handed out the assignment that referencing is something that you have to be able to do for this course and for all your courses here at Polytech, or if you go study somewhere else after this. And then depending on how formal the piece of work you're doing is, you'll have to use it in the workplace as well. So basically, if you're writing a piece of material that's using other people's ideas or research, then you need to know how to reference it. So we're going to talk about these four things. So what is referencing and why we reference, and then when and how are sort of the bulk of the content. So referencing, there's lots of different systems, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but at its core, it's just acknowledging where ideas have come from. So when you're doing work here or when you're doing work out in industry, it's absolutely fine for you to pull ideas from other places. If people have already done research that's helpful to you, or if you're talking about something that happened and you weren't actually there, you're going to be pulling ideas from other people, and that's good research, that's fine. But if you try and take credit for it, then that's a problem. So referencing is just about attributing the right ideas to the right people. So if you're using somebody else's work, it needs to be referenced. So we reference to acknowledge other people properly. It's polite, it's courteous. If you did work and somebody else used that, you would want to be referenced and acknowledged. It helps improve accuracy around information transfer because people can go back and check the original source. It helps other people find the research that you've done. It also shows how reliable your work is. So if you do a lot of really good research and you find a lot of really good sources, or you read things by really reputable people, then through your referencing, other people reading your work can see that and can see that this is a piece that it's okay to put some weight in, or to assume that there's some merit in there. And while you're studying, it's also to help avoid plagiarism. So we're particularly attuned to that as you study, but it is an issue in the workplace as well. If you are seen to be trying to take credit for ideas that are not your ideas, that could get you in some hot water. So there's an example sheet up on Moodle that you can go and have a look at, that Solar Flyer example sheet, and it's an example of an article on one side, and then on the other side there's summaries of it that are not referenced at all, referenced a little bit, and then referenced really well, and it's just to give you an idea of what we're looking for. So in terms of plagiarism, if we can see that you've made like an honest attempt at referencing but haven't quite got the referencing exactly right, then that's probably not going to be plagiarism. You won't get full marks for referencing in your assignments, but if it's not correctly done, but as long as we can see that you're trying to give credit where credit's due, then that's not plagiarism. If you don't reference ideas, or if you forget to reference something, or you don't make it clear that this isn't your own work or your own idea, then that's plagiarism, and that's not acceptable. And there are consequences here, and slightly different consequences in the workplace. Obviously at work they won't like dock you marks, but they may well not look forward to working with you in the future if you appear to take ideas from other people and not be honest about that. So you should reference basically any time you use something from somebody else. So if there's an idea, a theory that you sort of include in your own work, reference that. If you take a direct quote from somewhere, reference that. If it's a picture or a graph or any other sort of media, reference that. Basically, if it's come from somebody else, you need to reference it. But you don't need to reference it if it's part of sort of the public domain. So when you're talking about the example on the board, as if you're talking about gravity, you don't have to reference Newton, who is the man, of course, who first came up with it. Sort of public knowledge. Okay, so basically, if you knew it without having to go and find it, or you knew it without any specialist knowledge, you probably don't need to reference it. But if you knew it because you'd read a certain thing or seen a certain thing, then you may well need to reference it. Okay. And those can be formal sources, so like articles in journals, or they can be like newspapers or shows that you've watched, documentaries, sort of less formal, or it can be what's called grey literature, which is like maybe correspondences within businesses, sort of material that's not formal or peer reviewed, but can still be useful. So how to reference is obviously the most important part of this. So there's a couple of places that you reference. So the first place is in text. So as you're writing your essay or your report or whatever it is that you're writing, where you're using other people's ideas, you need to write what's called an in-text citation, so that we can pin down what idea in your work belongs to what person. So that's just a short citation. I'll show you the format for it soon. Then you reference in a reference list. So that's where you just write a list of, so all those short citations in your text are written out in full in your reference list. So it's got all the details. Obviously, you don't want to be writing a 2-page reference in the middle of your text, because it's a pain for your reader, makes things look messy or bulkier than they need to, and often the readers don't necessarily need to go back to your original source unless they really need more information. So that the reference list takes everything from your text and puts all the information in. And then there's something called a bibliography, which is slightly different. So the idea is that the reference list contains everything that you refer to in your report. So everything that you've cited in text is in your reference list. But if there's other stuff that you read that kind of informed your ideas around the topic but didn't get a direct reference in the text, so they sort of, other things were maybe more pertinent or more accurate for exactly what you wanted, but they kind of sat in the background a bit, then you include that in your bibliography. So usually that only happens when you're doing quite big bits of research. So for you guys, we normally just expect the in-text referencing and the reference list. But if you're doing a substantial piece of work, often there'll be a bunch of stuff that you read that's kind of helpful or would be helpful to your reader, but that you didn't put in necessarily, so it doesn't need to be on your reference list. Okay, so those are 3 places where we reference it. Here at Otago Polytech, we use what's called the APA referencing style, and that's the guide that you have in front of you now. So it's just a specific style for dealing with how we put information in what order and things like that. Using one referencing system and making it really consistent in your work helps your reader to understand your references, find information. It's also a lot easier, like once you get in the habit of referencing in a particular style, it's not too bad to keep up with. I don't know what your future employers, what style they'll ask you to use. They may not care, they may let you do any referencing style you want, but once you've gotten good at referencing, it's not too bad to move to another style once you learn what that style asks of you. Okay. So using APA, 2 things you need to think about. So the first is about what information you need to include in your reference, and it's different for in-text, which is short, or the full citation, full reference, and then what order to list that in. So the handout that I've given you now is really useful. I recommend hanging on to it. There's copies online as well. There's also quite a useful link, which is obviously just tiny here, from the University of Waikato, who have quite a good sort of like couple of pages on APA referencing that's just like the source and then an example of the referencing if you need a bit of extra something to look at. So either of those 2 will give you a good idea. Okay, so basically how APA referencing works is that it's got a set format, and that format is consistent but slightly different for if you are a book or a journal or a newspaper. So there's different ways of doing it for each of those. And there's different, obviously, slightly different ways of doing it if you're a book with 1 author, or if you're a book with 2 authors, or if you're a book with 7 authors. which can happen and is a real pain in the ass to type all the names out, but that's all right. So we'll do, on the screen now, I'll talk you through a couple of quite common examples. I'm not going to go through one of every possible thing you might ever reference, because once you get the idea, then you can use the referencing guide for your specific thing you're trying to reference. So a book with one author is really common. So your in-text citation, so when you use their idea, so blah, 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 here's an idea, then your in-text citation is just the author and the year of the publication. Okay. If you want to say King says that, blah-de-blah-de, then you say King in brackets 2000 writes that, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de. And that's your in-text citation. So you need the author and the year. If there's 2 authors, then you put your 2 authors. If there's 7 authors, then you put something called et al., which you'll see in your referencing guide. Basically, in the text, instead of writing it out fully and kind of taking up your whole paragraph, you shorten it down. So that's the important bit for the citation. Come on, arrows. There you go. So author, the surname, and the year, and then the full reference goes in this order. So it goes the author's surname and then their initial, and then the year in brackets, and then the title of the book is in italics. And then you put in the details about the publisher, so the location of the publisher and the publisher. Okay, so quite a lot of information. So the idea then is that anybody who was looking for this would be able to find this exact book. If it's like a 3rd or 4th edition of a book, you make a note of what edition it is, because sometimes editions differ slightly. Okay? So I should, based on your reference, be able to work out where in your text you use this idea, and then go to your full reference list and find the exact thing that you looked at. So if it's an online source that you looked at, it's usually really important that you note the date that you accessed it, because it could change over time, so I need to know sort of what version or at what point you looked at. Okay? Don't worry too much at this point about memorizing the order that you have to do things. As you do it, it'll become really natural, but you can always have that guide with you as you're writing your reports and things. Okay, so that's a book with one author. Okay. So then a journal article with one author. The in-text citation is the same. Again, it's just that surname and the year. If you have like 2 books by the same person, then usually they'll have different years, so you can distinguish which Gibbs piece you're talking about. If they publish 2 things in the same year, then you'll call it Gibbs A 2005 and Gibbs B 2005. It tends to happen with newspaper articles more than with journal articles, because obviously reporters can write things quicker than people who have to be peer reviewed. And then the full reference, again, the surname and then the initial, and then the year in brackets, and then the title this time is just normal for a journal article. So the title is normal, and then the journal title is in italics. Okay. And then the issue of the journal and the volume, and then you put the page numbers in the journal as well. Okay, and that's because with a book, obviously books kind of stand alone a bit, so the title's the bit that people need to be able to identify quickly when they're looking at the reference. With journals, it's often the case that journals have a good reputation or a poor reputation, and so being able to look and see what journal your article has come from is the important information that people want to look for. Okay, so for journals, the journal title, not the article title, is in italics. Okay, but it's the same sort of information. It's making sure that if I wanted to find that article, I could. And I could find the correct journal because I know the issue and the volume I know what pages I'm looking for to find the article. Okay. So again, don't try and memorize exactly what order the stuff needs to go in. Do try and memorize the in-text citation one, because that is quick and easy and you have to do it a lot. But hang on to your referencing guides and I'll show you through that. Okay. So it's a little bit nitty-gritty, or it can seem a little bit pedantic, but once you get used to it, it's not particularly difficult. It's quite systematic, and just displaying things in that same way really helps people when they're reading your research to know where your sources are from and what's going on.